France 24 debate. Now, Libya hasn't held an election in almost 50 years. During his 4 decades in power, the late dictator Muammar Gaddafi didn't even bother with sham elections. In fact, he outlawed political parties, and Libyans literally never went to the ballot box. Unsurprising then that many are a little apprehensive about this weekend. Around half of Libya's 6 million strong population are eligible to vote for a national congress on Saturday. That congress is to draft a national constitution and will then pave the way for a full parliamentary and presidential vote. So, is this Libya well and truly on its way to democracy, or is this a country still too divided just 9 months after the death of Muammar Gaddafi? Well, that's the subject of tonight's debate. Let me introduce you to my guests. Here in the studio with me is Dr. Lise Storm. She's a senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter. She's got 2 books in the works at the moment. One is Prospects for Democracy in the Maghreb, and the other one is The Arab Spring and the Advent of Democracy in North Africa. Joining us from Oxford in the UK tonight is Oliver Miles. He's a former ambassador to Libya. He's now the deputy chairman of the Libyan British Council. We're also hoping to be joined later in the programme by François Picard. He's the editorial manager of Arab Oil and Gas. He also works for the lobby group Amnesty International. But in Tripoli tonight, we're now joined by our very own Katherine Norris Trent. She's back in Libya after reporting there for us many, many times. Katherine, now you've been there all along throughout this struggle, haven't you? Just tell us a bit about the level of excitement heading towards these elections.
Well, there is a lot of optimism, certainly in Tripoli. People saying they see this as a very necessary first step to getting their country back to normal, although, of course, it hasn't been normal for much of the past 40 years, but they see it as getting it on the right footing, as it were. And they can definitely hear a lot of noise behind me, and that's because we're at a parade at the moment run by the Libyan National Army and the Interior Ministry, where they've been trying to recruit ex-rebels, these brigades that are all around the country. They're trying to recruit those members into the national security forces to try and unite them. And people are telling us they do want to unite. But if you travel around Libya, it's very easy, on the other hand, to meet these former rebel brigades or militias that term themselves, but these heavily armed groups of men who don't bear any central government. So while there is optimism about the elections, there's an awful lot of work getting this country unified in terms of an operational sense.
Absolutely, and logistically this is a huge task as well, considering we're talking about a country that doesn't have any democratic institutions. We've got around 4,000 candidates running in this election, some of them affiliated to political parties, some of them independents. It's quite a lot for the Libyan people themselves to digest, isn't it?
It's an awful lot for them to take into account, and we've been speaking to Libyan voters. While they're very pleased this day is coming, they don't fully understand what all of these candidates or political lists stand for, and they're saying they're having difficulty choosing between them. Now, the elections were delayed, the sort of campaigning was delayed as well, and there are a huge number of candidates, and they run out 30 seconds each on television to explain. And obviously, multi-party democracy, multi-candidate democracy is thing here for most Libyans. So they're having a head around it.
All right, Katherine, we're losing you on the sound front slightly. So let's move on. Let's listen to some more voices in Libya as we head towards these elections.
Many people have started to have doubts about the effectiveness of the upcoming elections at the National Assembly. Who would you elect and why? Elections require safety above anything else.
It's an honor to participate in something that is happening in Libya for the first time in history.
They want to force us to participate. We don't want to be forced into it. Don't they say that the Libyan people are free? So we're free. How can we vote when we're still refugees living in tin houses?
All right, as you heard, there are differing levels of interest and indeed trust in the political process. Oliver Miles, is Libya ready for this election?
Yes, I think so. Of course, as you've explained, it's a great adventure for Libya. But my impression is that most Libyans want the elections. They'd be very disappointed if they'd been postponed more than a couple of weeks, which is what happened. And I think they will go into them in good faith. And to some extent, this is evidenced by the fact that there have already been local elections in Benghazi and in Misrata, which went through well. They had a decent turnout. They had a decent result. Everybody, I think, was pleased with those local elections. So we're hoping for the best on Saturday.
Dr. Storm, do you agree with that? Do you think Libya is ready and this is going to be the first step towards a real democracy?
I understand the Libyan people's desire to go to the ballot box because they haven't been able to for so long. But no, I don't think Libya is ready. I don't think that you see the fundamental building blocks for having a democracy and for having elections. We lack genuine political parties in Libya, and so I think this is too hasty.
What do you make of that, Oliver Miles? There's a lack of actual political parties. I mean, there isn't a lack of them. There are actually too many. We've got more than 140 political parties running in this election, and as we heard our correspondents say, some of them, getting 30 seconds on television to lay out their policies. Do people actually know what they're voting for here?
They'll be voting for individuals, I think, largely. You're right. The political parties have very little history in Libya. They're new. Two of them, I think, are in one way or another related to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a well-known organization, but which doesn't exist as a party in Libya. One of them is related to something called the National Salvation Front, which was one of the main resistance organizations against Gaddafi, but that was, I think, almost entirely outside Libya. Inside Libya, no, there's not much to build on. And I take the point that elections are not the whole story. Having an election is not the same thing as having a democracy, but you have to start somewhere, and this is where they want to start.
Katherine Norris Trent, I think No, Catherine's not back with us. Dr. Storm, what are your thoughts on that then? I mean, as you said, Libya, they have to start somewhere, don't they? This is a very chaotic process in some ways, but they've got to get on with it. They have to bring about democracy. This is what, at the end of the day, what the people want.
I just think that everything is taking place too quickly. Also, the timelines for adopting a new constitution, for instance, everything is so rushed, and I think it's dangerous because I think what we risk seeing is the institutionalization of a system that's not necessarily democratic in that the components are not that democratic. I'm afraid of seeing the election of a parliament and the composition of a government that's not able to take decisions swiftly enough, which means that some people will become disaffected and perhaps then it will add those that want civil war. And so I'm afraid that kind of thing would happen. But I'm also afraid that people might vote for the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations or other Islamist organizations that are more conservative, and then you will see a regime that's also authoritarian, but in a different kind of way to the Gaddafi regime.
In a different guise. And who do you think is rushing Libya into this then? Do you think this is forces within the country or forces outside the country?
Both. I mean, I think that people in Libya are genuinely excited that now they can vote and choose who should run the country. And also it's necessary to move forward so that people don't lose momentum. But I'm also thinking that the international community is keen for elections to take place so that they can say, well, now Libya is done and dusted and we can move on to Syria, for instance, or Yemen. But I do think that it's perhaps worthwhile to just slow down a little bit. And I think that Tunisia is actually a good example of how setting aside nearly a whole year for drafting a constitution is perhaps a good idea rather than 3 months, I think we need to pace ourselves so that it doesn't go off track.
Let's bring back our correspondent Katherine Norris Trent in Tripoli. Katherine, I hope you were listening to that. Is there, in your experience, a feeling in Libya that forces outside the country are hurrying this along? They want democracy brought to Libya quickly and they want it done now?
We do hear that. There are people who feel there's been too much foreign interference in their country, people with an agenda. Throughout the whole revolution, we've heard that from various factions. People now suspecting that money is being pumped into some of the many political parties who are contesting this election. Some of that is just hearsay and superstition, of course. But people are very clear they want Libya to do this by themselves, that it's their moment now. And the vast majority of people we're speaking to think this is the way forward, that putting their vote in the ballot box is going to help in some small way. People are realistic. They know this is not going to change overnight. They know there's a lot of work to be done. But they are telling us that they see this as a way forward now.
And what about these militia? Now, these are the groups that ousted Muammar Gaddafi in the first place. Ragtag rebel groups, they used to be called, but now they're very well armed. They're quite powerful. And some say they're going about the country acting with impunity, determined to exact revenge on anyone who supported Muammar Gaddafi.
Well, that's right. You can travel around different parts of Libya and you see these rebel brigades or militias still there, still heavily armed, and they're very much in control of certain regions. It's they who rule, not central government. In several regions, I was down in the south of Libya myself, and they said that central government had absolutely no control there, that it was they who ran the roost. And then there are allegations that these rebel militias have been exacting their own forms of justice. And we saw in the south of Libya camps of immigrants who'd come through the border who the rebels, these brigades, were now dealing with, and they'd seized their passports and they were locking them up with no legal system behind them. So it's clear the rule of law doesn't extend to every corner of Libya. But what's actually happening, interestingly, where I am tonight is a ceremony for former rebels who are now being integrated into the central Libyan security forces. So thousands of men, the central government's keen to point out that they've already inaugurated several thousand former fighters into the national services, and they say that's going to continue, and that's a step on getting Libya back under some kind of central control, back under the rule of law.
Oliver Miles, what's your view on the militia? I mean, the United Nations criticised the National Transitional Council back in March for not doing enough to rein these groups in. As I say, they are well armed. We've seen gun battles in various cities, particularly in Zintan, in Beni Walid and elsewhere. Are they a real obstacle to democracy, do you think? I mean, some are even talking about civil war.
The situation is certainly fragile, and of course it would be better if all these armed men were under the control of the central government, and they aren't. The situation is particularly difficult in the far south and one or two other areas. But let's have a look at what's happened in Zintan in the last few days, because the Zintani brigade are one of the most independent, I believe, of the brigades. Now, they are holding Saif al-Islam Gaddafi. As you know, they were visited in the last weeks by a delegation from the International Criminal Court. That seems to have gone well, in the sense that they found that Saif al-Islam was being properly looked after, he's held in decent conditions. Then there was a row because the ICC people were alleged to have behaved improperly. They were said to be carrying secret correspondence between Saif al-Islam Gaddafi and one of his henchmen, and the Zintanis detained them. What was the outcome? The outcome was that the Libyan government went to Zintan, they negotiated with the Zintanis, they negotiated with the International Criminal Court, and the result is these people have been released. Now, I think that is a credit to the government, it's a credit to the Zintanis, it's certainly not a credit to the International Criminal Court, but that's another matter.
There is a level of distrust, though, in the country, isn't there? There are tribes, there are tribal loyalties in Libya that, in some respects, outweigh the desire for a national government. This is the real fundamental issue with Libya, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is. I think that what you've said is true in some areas. For example, in Kufra, where for many years, in fact, I think there's always been problems between the tribes which are now part of Libya, like the Zuwai, and the Tabu, who are partly Libyan and partly Chadian. But in the northern part of the country, where nearly everybody lives, I don't think what you say is true at all. And I would give as evidence for that the fact that in February, when they celebrated the anniversary of the beginning of the revolution in 2011, in February this year, when they celebrated the first anniversary, I'm told, I wasn't there myself, but I'm told there was virtually a street party throughout the whole country. Everybody was out in the streets enjoying themselves. There were no security incidents at all, no sign of division.
Dr. Storm, what are your thoughts on that?
I do agree to a certain extent that people are keen to have a coherent and democratic Libya. I am worried about the militias, though, because they are strong. I've heard people say, well, at least the army is not strong, so you won't see a similar problem to the one experienced in Egypt. But militias are dangerous too, as you've seen in Iraq, for instance, and it is difficult to integrate them. And I think one of my fears is that the elections might make it worse, in the sense that some of these people will get power by running as independents, because everyone knows that people tend to vote on the basis of local ties. But another fear is that the international community will simply close its eyes to what's going on. I mean, yes, there might be a street party and people might be celebrating, but a lot of people are also being killed and tortured on a daily basis because they belong to the wrong side in the rebellion. And this is happening even today, and I think we should not forget this.
Katherine Norris Trent, what are your views on that? We're talking about the division and how tribal loyalties in Libya could outweigh, and in some cases do outweigh, a commitment to a national project. That it's the case that people from one city to another just don't trust each other, and it will be very, very difficult to build that kind of trust.
Well, it very much depends where you go in Libya, as one of your guests was saying. I've had very few people, though, telling me that they don't want Libya to remain a single unified state. On the other hand, if you travel to the south, there's a great deal of distrust there between different communities. The Tubu community, which are a tribe in the south of Libya as well as in neighbouring states, but they're very distrustful of some of the Arabic tribes in that region as well. And they say that the interim government and the rebel brigades from the north are persecuting them, are trying to strip them of their rights and of their power. So clearly tensions running very high there, and we've seen that break out into deadly violence, in fact. It's true that there have also been clashes around the northwestern mountains, around Zintan, just a few weeks ago with a neighbouring village. Again, accusations flying around about which side the various fighters were on during the revolution, and along the western coast in Zawiya as well. We've seen gun battles break out only sporadically over the past year, but there's clearly there's clearly some settling of scores going on, and it is going to be a challenge to try and reunite people. But once again, I've heard very few people actually say that they want independence for their part of Libya. People say that they might want a federal state, they might want to have a big say in running it, but very few people are saying they want to break away.
And I guess another thing, Oliver Miles, to recommend the situation in Libya is, of course, the lack of sectarian divisions. Everyone in Libya, or more or less, is Sunni Muslim.
Yes, Libya has two big advantages if you compare it with other Arab states. One is the one you've mentioned, that everybody, virtually all Libyans are Sunni Muslims. The other is, of course, that they have a lot of money. And so the central government is in a position to pay people, for example, to pay people to come into the central military, to persuade people to leave the militias. They don't have the awful economic problems or financial problems that their neighbours have. They still have economic problems. They have a terrible problem of unemployment, and they're going to have to address that, and it won't be easy. But that's, I'm afraid, something that will have to be done in slower time. But at least they have some cash, which is a big help.
All right.
There are some divisions within Libya. There are some.
Oliver Miles, hold that thought. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt you. We are going to have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have the international headlines for you and the second part of this debate. Don't go away.